Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Theory from the Margins lecture series. I am Merve Tabur, researcher and lecturer in comparative literature at the University of Oslo and Utrecht University, and I will be moderating today's session. Our next event will be a lecture by Premesh Lalu on the 30th of May, so please keep an eye on our website and social media accounts for further details. Before we move on to introducing today's speaker, I'd like to say a few words about who we are and what we do as Theory from the Margins. The Theory from the Margins collective deep reads on current scholarship on postcolonial theory, the decolonial turn, and theory building from the global south. The collective reads works from marginalized communities in the global north and south, as well as critical interventions based on in-depth studies of marginalized groups. Theory from the Margins is primarily interested in the contemporary global academe's engagement with what we understand to be theory, and it aims to spark broader discussions about theoretical concepts outside of academia. I am joined today by my colleague, research fellow Patrick Brock from the Department of Culture Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo, and by research fellow Taeyang Teron from the Norwegian School of Theology and Society. Without further ado, I now leave the floor to Patrick to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Merve. Today's guest, Madina Tlostanova, is a decolonial thinker, fiction writer, and professor of postcolonial feminisms in the Department of Thematic Studies at Linköping University, Sweden. She has written extensively on decolonial thought, particularly in its aesthetic, existential, and epistemic manifestations. Feminisms of the Global South, the Post-Socialist Human Condition, Fiction and Art, Critical Future Inquiries, and Critical Interventions into Complexity, Crisis, and Change. Her recent books include Postcolonialism and Post-Socialism in Fiction and Art, Resistance and Re-existence from 2017, as well as What Does It Mean to be Post-Soviet? Decolonial Art from the Ruins of the Soviet Empire from 2018, along with A New Political Imagination Making the Case from 2020, co-authored with Tony Fry. Released in March 2023 by Routledge Press, her new book, titled Narratives of Unsettlement, Being Out-of-joint as a Generative Human Condition, uses interdisciplinary intermediational approach to reflect on the relational complexity of unsettlement as a predominant sensibility of the present epoch. The book tackles interrelated aspects of unsettlement, including temporality, disconcerting effects of the Anthropocene, the biomedical facets of unsettlement, and the post-pandemic futures. It uses a chimeric approach combining essayistic and speculative fiction writing methods, negotiating rational, affective, and imaginative ways of inquiry, and showing rather than merely explaining. The book poses questions, but gives no ready-made answers, and invites us to think together on the unsettlement as a negatively global human condition that can be collectively made into a generative mode of resurgence and refuturing. I leave the floor now to Professor Tlostanova.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. I'm really happy and honored to be here today with you. Thank you for inviting me. I mean, I do a lot of talks these days, but not very often talks based on books. It's really an honor, to be offered to talk about your new book, because for us, books are like babies, like children, at least for me. This is how I treat my books. And this is my latest child, and a very difficult one, and I will tell you why. And that's why, it's always wonderful to be able to share some thoughts and some sensibilities that are related to this book, to its emergence and why I wrote it. Because, writing books is an existential thing. We write books because we cannot not write them, right? And that's why I think it's very important to share it with others. Also, as I was saying like a few minutes ago, I was trained as a literary scholar, as a scholar in the field of world literatures and comparative literatures. And although I had to leave that area behind because there were no jobs, how they're shrinking everywhere in the world, I still miss this. And literature is my first love. And maybe that's why, along with being an academic, I was always writing fiction. And again, this book is very weird, and indeed it's a chimeric book because it is not quite fiction, and at the same time it's not an academic book, but it's something in between. It's a hybrid. Why unsettlement? Why unsettlement? Because I guess the simplest answer is that I myself a profoundly unsettled person. I have never felt anywhere at home at any point in my life. And I say this actually in the book, I think in one of the chapters, that my credo is to be a bird, not a tree. I always say I'm a bird, not a tree. And that, of course, is the ultimate unsettlement as a human condition. And I guess most of the works, most of my academic works were always about that in this or other way. They were about unhomed writers or, the writers who, immigrated from one country to another or wrote in many different languages and wrote a book about multiculturalism many years ago. So it's always this or that way about unsettlement. And yet this particular book is definitely special because it's the child of the pandemic. I started writing it during the pandemic and finished it when the pandemic was almost over. And I think that was important because the pandemic acted as a powerful legitimacy crisis trigger for many people, and especially for the people who were around me, because for the last 8 years, I've been living in Sweden and working in Sweden. So it's like the epitome of the global north, right? And very specific in that sense. And so you can't say that it's a margin or it's a border sensibility, of course, but maybe in other ways. I mean, we won't go too far into that. But still, I mean, it's definitely the global north. And even in this global north, people who are around me, they finally realized that they are in a deep legitimacy crisis. Something that they always believed in all of a sudden was not true anymore. I could see many people who, for the first time in their lives, questioned the interiorized notions of their presumable collective invulnerability, And certainly this strange, dizzy sense of uprootedness, of this volatility, of instability of the social structure, it wasn't just because of the pandemic. It started creeping into this texture of local life much before the pandemic. But the pandemic definitely has developed this clear sense of uncertainty and confusion. And what I soon came to realize was that I was witnessing a shift, a qualitative shift, which was finally launching the world into the 21st century. Because I started thinking, like, can we say that we are already living in the 21st century, or culturally we are not yet? Or politically we are not yet, and I think we are not really, because a lot of political concepts, they are so old-fashioned and so outdated, and that's why they don't work in this new condition. So that was my first reaction of sensibility, like what to do about that, about this shift, and how are we actually entering this extremely dark and hopeless 21st century, not chronologically, but in cultural and political sense, in social and technological sense, and many other sense. So I sense that the shifts were tectonic, yet they were very hard to grasp, to capture, because they were enacted in ways that defied conventional interpretations, because they were not clad, in more habitual forms that humanity is used to. Like when you say, okay, then came the revolution, or then came the war, major, World War I. And everything changed. That is easier to grasp and understand because this is how historiography conventionally works, right? But in this case, it was much more difficult to grasp, yet the changes are no less serious, I would say. And then, of course, an abominable war unleashed by the Russian dictator at the end of the pandemic seemed to reproduce the situation of the 100 years ago, but in reverse, in the looking glass logic. Because if you remember, in 1918, the Spanish flu followed on the heels of World War I. In 2022, the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine has complemented to the fast COVID crisis with a familiar geopolitical conflict, military conflict, that seemingly brought the world back to the worn-out logic that we remember from modernity, from the 19th century, from the 20th century. Yet, I think it was actually a mistaken feeling, because unlike the early 20th century, the biomedical and the geopolitical, in this case, have intertwined. They complexified each other, generating and intensifying additional elements of the crisis in which we live. What I mean is that in the beginning of the 20th century, the war and the Spanish flu were not connected in the imaginary, in the collective imaginary. So the war ended and the pandemic was very soon forgotten. And even if we look at literature and fiction, we don't have too many books that directly, openly discuss the Spanish flu. And it's really an interesting topic also, why it happened like that. And in this case, what we are experiencing today is a bit different, I think, or maybe not a bit, because we can't really say where the effects of the pandemic, of the COVID pandemic, end, and the effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine start. All of these things are very, very much entangled and intertwined, and they intensify each other. And I think that also triggers the future step changes, such as a hopeless enviroclimatic dynamic and the quick unfolding of additional, I would say, human hierarchies and inequalities that are bound to, they are already here, but they are bound to proliferate in the 21st century. And that's another thing, like how can you get unsettled? Not only because, for example, you are of the wrong race, or skin color, right? But also, for example, because you don't have access to technologies, because you don't have access to specific technologies that are from now on will be considered a sign of a privileged people. And that, I think, is also something that we sometimes forget about. And it's also part of being unsettled and doomed in many ways. So when the pandemic hit, we were finishing writing together with Tony Fry, whom Patrick already mentioned today. We were co-writing together a book on the new political imagination. And one of the key concepts in that book was actually unsettlement. But while writing the book with Tony, I realized that for me, unsettlement is in fact a defining concept. It's not one of the things, but it's the most important. It's the key category. And the age which humanity has entered in the last decades of the 20th century, and in which I think we will maybe live for a while now, is definitely this age of unsettlement. We have addressed many other features of the current crisis with Tony, such as derelationality, meaning that knowledge goes into narrow disciplines and they are disconnected. And so we know more and more data, but we understand less and less about the world. Then, of course, chronophobia, the fear of time and the fear of change, the geopolitical chaos and fragmentation, the environmental collapse, and, of course, massive human migration. And I think that maybe triggered my thinking about being unsettled, because, of course, the figure of the migrant, of the refugee, is the ultimate realization of unsettlement in most physical sense, but also in psychological and existential sense. And so for me, all of these sides of the crisis somehow are derivative or act as concrete manifestations of unsettlement as the main sensibility and condition of the world. As I said, it's primarily an existential condition of in-betweenness, of uncertainty. It's a kind of a life in crisis as such, life that is constantly lived in crisis, marked as a constant negotiation between belonging and non-belonging, rootedness and displacement, a fear of changes and a fear that changes will never come, or the future that we all want to come, but we also are afraid that it will never come, or there is, the future is canceled. So that's why the idea of the future is also in focus in this book. Another important thing is that when we say I'm unsettled or these people are unsettled, we always presume that being settled is good and being unsettled is not good. And that also comes from a very specific, frame of frame of looking at things, I guess, right? It's normalized to think that people can feel safe only when they are settled in a community, in a land, in a space, in a family, in some group thinking, in religion. And although the majority of this planet's population has been actually unsettled most of the history time, right? Many centuries, unsettling tendencies are growing now, of course. This is still not seen as normative. And that's why, for me, of course, I don't want to normalize unsettlement, but I want us to change our outlook at it. I want us to learn how to look at it in a generative sense and see it as a source or an opportunity to rethink something, to change something, to go to this re-existing element, to recreate our world, our social and cultural world differently. So that, of course, needs us to learn to regard unsettlement as not something to overcome via settlement or settling down, not only as a negative condition of restraint and exclusion, but potentially as an open, positive, creative state. And that was one of my ideas also behind this book. I wanted the sensibility of unsettlement to also be palpable in the way the book is written, I wanted to experiment with the form, with the language, with the composition. And soon I realized that it cannot be written as an academic book, just as it cannot be written within any single academic discipline. Instead of that, I wanted an open, probing, intermediational, kind of approach that would also have some artistic strategies, relational strategies in it. And that's why, as I said, it's written somehow as a hybrid text in which you find short stories or speculative fictions, I would rather call them. And also essays that are also not written as articles, but more like essays, but more in a philosophical tradition, I would say, than any kind of social science text. And that was also very important for me. And that's why I refer to this book as a chimera, as not quite fiction, not quite academic book, something in between. And I was actually very lucky to find publishers who would agree to publish such a book, because publishers also are very strict with their format these days, And so Nina Lilke and Jeff Hearn's book series at Routledge, luckily were not afraid of my chimera text and didn't attempt to discipline it in any way, but actually encouraged me. And even suggested, for example, like, why don't you put the fictions forward? So in each part of the book, it consists of 3 parts. First, usually I put the fiction to set the tone. So you read the fiction in which I try to show rather than explain a certain complex problem, let's say, right? And then you can read a more traditionally written essayistic text in which I maybe also try to explain something. I would say that my previously written academic books, they always left me unsatisfied and haunted by their unavoidable ellipses, silences, because some things you cannot explain academically. It just doesn't work. And that's why usually I would write a text, a monograph, and then I would write a novel or a short story collection in which I address the things that you cannot express with an academic language or academic way of reasoning or logic or whatever. But with this book, everything was the other way around. First, I wrote a string of speculative fictions, and then I added some essays, and they all came together. And I mean, in that sense, I have maybe a strange approach. I usually listen to the text as it unfolds. It tells me stories, and then I follow them. I have to be very open and very humble and listen to this melody and try to put it on paper the way it wants to be put, rather than, come with a rational approach and some scheme and some plan. I don't do that, at least not with books. And in that sense, of course, it is a very dear child. But at the same time, you can imagine how difficult it would have been if the editors or the publishers would make me change anything there, right? And in that sense, I was very lucky because I didn't have to change anything. I didn't have any serious kind of, comments from 2 wonderful peer reviews. I mean, they had suggestions, but not any kind of critique, serious critique. And at the same time, as I said, since the book took some years, 2 years or a year and a half to write, of course, the world was changing so rapidly around. So each time I had a chance, I had to write something additional. I had to change some, I had to add something, another layer to it. And in that sense, I really felt that it was writing as a method of inquiry. It was writing as a mode of inquiry, which I always loved to do. I always tell students about this, like this could be your method of research, writing as such. But then I wanted to also try to do it and actually, kind of have a whole text written like that, so that the whole ideas come as you write them, and writing itself generates these ideas. So that was an experiment in a sense, because it's very, very different, as you all know, from the kind of writing that is imposed on us more and more through kind of academic articles and journals that think that first you do some kind of applied research and then you write down, summarize the results, and this is how your academic texts appear. But that was the opposite of this, of course. Another thing, of course, that I also need to mention, because I come from the feminist tradition and the colonial feminist tradition. And in this tradition, as you know, storytelling is in focus, often, or it's oral storytelling. It's what Sylvia Wynter addresses in her well-known term, homo narrans, right? The human being that tells the stories, narrates the stories, a complex hybrid of biological and storytelling and symbol-making elements. That was important, I think, for me. I always had it in the back of my mind, writing. And the fact that you write with your bodies. And here, of course, you can trace it back to Gloria Anzaldúa and to Maria Lugones and other decolonial radical feminists who actually wrote a lot about that, but also, interestingly enough, to not only to border traditions, but also to Western traditions. For example, to Helen Sixou, who was also writing in the 80s, I think, and early 90s, about these similar things, like how you write through your body, and your writing process is so much connected with your corporeal, affective, and that, of course, was totally true about me, being stuck in the Swedish apartment for 2 years by myself. It was a social experiment, right? So some of the stories are connected to this experience of, not having any, not only human, but any other species around me, and being completely isolated. So in that sense, of course, there are some reflections on the changing human nature and how our nature can change as a result of such experimental things or natural things we don't know, as COVID. So that was one of the things. And of course, I can't say that, my view of unsettlement is kind of final, right? Of course, it's very subjective. It's how I see it. But I decided that I need to have 3 main parts on the book in which I address different aspects of unsettlement. And this is how its, structure came to be. One part, it deals with temporality, indeed, as you mentioned in the introduction, in which I kind of revisit the modern colonial ideas of progress, progressivism, the happy future that is promised in many narratives, religious narratives, but also secular, such as Marxism and socialism, right? And what happens when we don't have them? Can we actually bring future dimension back? And how can we do that, right? Is it possible? Who can do that if social movements are questionable, political movements are very outdated, and it's only artists or writers who are left with this task of bringing imagination back to the scene, so to say, right? To kind of trying to work together with other people to kind of train your imagination, political imagination, and other forms of imagination, because I think this is one of the main problems. That's why we wrote the book with Tony also, because the imagination is dead. Nobody can anymore imagine things. Like look at the politicians all over the world. I mean, they cannot think in any long-term kind of frames of thinking, right? And that's why environmental problems are so kind of neglected. I mean, even if they're discussed a lot, but nothing is actually done. So that is a very good example, I think, of what is happening, of this chronophobia and fear of change and the status quo, kind of, love for status quo. Let's not change anything. Let's come back to normal as it used to be. And I think what is happening in these 2 last years, the 2.5 years, shows very well that there is no status quo, and we will never come back to what was before. But we are still too afraid to imagine a different world, I think, because we were trained not to do that by education and many other factors. And that's why I think I needed to write a book, to maybe find other people among my readers who would be also interested in imagining and reimagining things together, and trying to actually look for the ways to make this step from just imagining sitting in the university in the ivory tower to actually doing something. Because that's another thing, like we sit in the universities, and the universities and educational systems do everything to prevent us from actually affecting the world and changing anything there. And that's why, for me, I work a lot with artists. I work a lot with museums and exhibitions in the last 10 years, because there I find some agency. I find still some elements that allow to have this community, to have this sort of communities of change, deep coalitions that Lugones used to write about. Of course, they are very fragile, they're very volatile, and especially that we are still right in the midst of neoliberal modernity, right, with its darker colonial side. But at the same time, I think we should at least try to create these little spaces, these fissures of alternative living. And one concept that I really, and it will be the last thing I would say, one concept that I really got interested in, paradoxically through being here in Sweden, because very popular here, it's a concept of worlding. But of course, in Sweden, worlding is known mainly through this kind of tradition of Haraway and Barad, and people like that, which is fine. Yeah, but for me, of course, as a colonial or post-colonial person, it always lacked a lot of things, because it was a very specific privileged view of a white person, who does not see these differences and intersections, maybe, or they're not important for them. At the same time, I think worlding is also a key category in many indigenous traditions and some post-colonial traditions as well, but they're just not very well known texts in the West. And also, interestingly enough, artists, writers are the people who work with it. They maybe don't use the word worlding, but this is what they do. They imagine different worlds. They go and just kind of create alternative ways of living to help us maybe realize that we're not stuck. It's our decision not to be stuck, or we can't change the world. And we just, we imagine that we are not free, but in fact, we can be free. It's just about a different political imagination and a different, way of looking at settlement and unsettlement as well. And so that was, I think, the underlying idea of writing the book. Yeah, I think I should stop here. Maybe you have questions and we can discuss things that are more interesting for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madina, for this wonderful talk and for sharing your own process of writing the book. We will now take questions both from the panelists and from the audience. Participants, if they have any questions, they can put their questions in the Q&A section, and we will pose the questions. Patrick, do you want to start?
Thank you. I wanted to start with a question about the multi-generic, in your words, chimeric structure of the book, which allows you to merge creative writing and theory, showing and telling. What are the implications of this chimeric format for the future of humanities scholarship and for the future of humanities education? Would you say that this writing style is or will be a distinctive feature of post-humanities scholarship and pedagogy?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's a very good question and very relevant because I'm now working very intensely on new humanities, and I'm responsible at my university for kind of, humanities hub in which we're trying to rethink humanities, which is especially difficult because my university is not humanities oriented, it's very technological. And so we are kind of in a ghetto to begin with, and we have to justify ourselves all the time. But I think it's a very good question because as I know from my own experience, students actually love when you allow them to do this kind of thing. When you say, I don't need you to write a boring paper, but you can write a poem if you want, or you can write a speculative fiction. And they create amazing things, with such deep ideas, complex, which probably they wouldn't be able to express if they were kind of framed within specific disciplines or approaches, or a set of tools that are given to them, mechanically and in this kind of instrumental way that is so much promoted by liberal universities. So I really like it. And I try to do it all the time. Like we never have seminars in which they just read the book and retell it, it's so boring. But instead of that, we have all of this kind of theater of the press and this and that. I think it's so much better. And this kind of actually triggers them to create also, not to just sit there as a consumer of knowledge or somebody who came to the university to be entertained by the professors, but somebody who creates knowledge together with you. So you learn from each other. And it's not just words, because there are so many ways you can do it in the classroom, but you are right, it's not easy. Because whenever I give texts like that, of course, I don't give my own text, but I give some unconventional text to read. For instance, even if you give indigenous thinkers like Leanne Simpson, Beta Samasaka Simpson text, for instance, they are amazing, and I use them a lot. For example, in the course in which we discuss disciplinarity and post-disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, because I work at the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies, it's thematic studies. So it's important that the students understand what it means. Some of them are very hesitant with its text because they are not written as conventional Western academic articles or texts, right? It's a different logic. And they say, oh, but it's a fairy tale, it's a myth. So then the myth is dismissed, right? But not all of them. It's usually like, 10% of students who are, difficult to convince that it's also knowledge, or it's also interesting, or it's kind of brings some new ideas to you. It doesn't matter how it's written. The majority of them, I think, more and more are open to this. And it's more the university that is, as an institution, reluctant to do that. Because as you know, universities are now becoming more and more business structures, and there are more and more people who are not actually teaching anything or creating knowledge, but they're just sitting and have all sorts of regulations. And very often, of course, these regulations are very much against what we're doing, right? So you're teaching a course in which you say, okay, so we will not be writing a paper that is conventional, and then they have a set of rules of how you should assess papers. Right. And this, of course, will be the opposite of what you're trying to do. But in this sense, I think, at least I've been doing it for all my life. I act as a trickster. You infiltrate the system from within, and then you do what you need with the students, and they always appreciate that. They write to you 20 years after and say, okay, I still remember how we did the theater of the oppressed, and now it helps me survive, So I think we have to do it. Of course, we cannot close universities right now, but we need to while we are there, and we have some powers within, not much maybe, but some. We have to do this. And I think that we should give more texts, like I was trying to, not necessarily my text, but there's so many texts like that, so that people are more exposed to this, and they see that you can express what you need to express, not necessarily through formulas or whatever, some social scientific text. So I'm all for it.
Well, I'll ask the next question. So you've mentioned how creative writing, fiction writing allows you to explore depths and complexities of meanings and concepts that may not be possible through like simple theoretical or academic writing. And in the book, you mentioned that when you're writing fiction, you have future readers in mind, and you find the fictional form more appropriate and effective for reaching to these future readers. So I'm wondering, how effective do you think speculative fiction or fiction in general can be as a form of praxis? Like, do you find it sufficient? Like, how should we supplement the speculative fiction? And what bridges the gap between individual transformations, individual narratives, individual forms of world building, and broader, larger scale transformations?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I mean, it's wonderful, and I wish we knew the answer, right? Then we would change the world tomorrow. But I think that, again, even if we know that it's not going to happen immediately, we have to work on this. And the colonial thinking is about that. It's not about doing a revolution. It's about working day by day with people's thinking, helping them realize the coloniality of thinking that they've been brought up in, and question it, and kind of question other things, coloniality of being and coloniality of sensing and perception. And this, I think, that we do in our courses and in writing also, and especially in visual arts and some films, that there's so many wonderful examples today of. For example, now in the Netherlands, there is a wonderful exhibition in the Eye Museum by my friend and also an artist about whom I write a lot, Saudat Ismailova. And she is, for me, an ultimate example of exactly that, like how can you decolonize visuality, how you can work with film as a medium, which tends to be very colonialist, because the film gaze, it's like the ultimate manifestation of this male gaze, kind of anthropological gaze, the tourist gaze, everything. And she does that. She experiments even with the camera and what you can do with that. So I think that this works wonderfully. When you show to students the film like that and then have a discussion, it's much more effective than reading 3 articles that may work or not, because as humans, we do, first of all, react maybe not rationally, but not only rationally, but also in this affective way and emotional way. And so teaching is about that. And that's why, I'm very hesitant when I say, let's only have Zoom teaching or something. Yes, it's wonderful. But now we see how wonderful it is. We can talk with you, right? But if all teaching goes into Zoom, I think university would die, because it's much more than that. It's also important to have a contact with people, to see them, to be in the same room together, to have some exercises that are not about talking only, because we're not talking machines. We are humans, right? So we are also animals that, of a specific kind, but it's also an important element of how we connect. So I think that in that sense, speculative fiction is amazing because it works on all of these levels. It works rationally, of course, because it's some kind of dystopia usually, right? But it also works on this level, like you imagine yourself in that situation, you identify or you disidentify with what you read. And also what I mean is what you can't say, because speculative fiction is usually about the future, right? You imagine the future, which is far away or very close. Usually I write about close futures. And it's something that you cannot write in an article, because you will immediately have a peer reviewer who will say, how can you prove this? How do you know what the future will be like? So there are certain rules in the academic writing, which are wrong also, of course, right? But they prevail. Like if you cannot prove this with some kind of, something like maybe field work or some important references, then it's not scientific. It's not relevant, right? And so there are many things that you can claim in a fiction, or you can take it further, let's say, and imagine something that doesn't exist, but there is a tendency to that already, right? So you take it further, and then you imagine what would happen if in the world, for instance, in one of my stories in this book, there is a world in which maybe there is no racism in the present sense anymore, but there is this technological racism. And so everybody who doesn't have access to changing themselves into cyborgs are dehumanized. they are seen as their lives are not relevant anymore, right? And so you imagine the situation. And in that sense, I think it helps a lot, really, to show rather than explain, or to combine both things, to have something like Donna Haraway does in her latest things. Like she has some kind of more traditional writing, but she also has a speculative fiction. And I think it's very effective and shocking sometimes, right? But this should be used, and also the students should do that. It's not only that you bring somebody's fiction to the classroom, but I think it's also important to kind of encourage them to write things. For example, we have exercises of memory writing together. We have exercises of automatic writing together, and then they can rework it into fiction or into something, you know. And it's a lot of people, because they are so technologically advanced, the students, they're not like me or the old person, you know, but they do all sorts of vlogs, and they send it to you. It's wonderful. And so much better, I think, than forcing them into this narrow frames and saying, okay, you have to quote this list of things. No, they have to be free. And I really wish we used more of fiction and speculative fiction and cinema and, documentary films. Should be like that, yes.
Thank you, Madina. Now we have some questions from our participants. The first question is from John van de Wet. How can knowledge creation and a more universal understanding episteme be created if we do not have a structured understanding which can be understood? If knowledge is being created in multivarious ways, then how do we buy into it as a collective? Is everything individualized, or must we sacrifice something for something? What are the implications of freeing us from the colonial standard by sacrificing any sense of standard?
Yeah, but that's a standard question, right? People are so fixed on having some standard that it's very scary if standard is questioned. No, of course there should be standards. Although I don't like the word standard, I think I would rather say that there should be an area of entangled, intersecting ideas or epistemologies, or onto-epistemologies, I would say even, in which we keep our differences, because that is the key thing. We have to be able to keep our differences, because we're all equal, as you remember the Zapatistas said, right? Because we're all equal, we have the right to be different. So the differences must be kept, because indeed the humanity is over that, idea that there should be one truth with a capital letter, or one idea of happiness that everybody should follow. What is outside shows this very well. Marxism was one such idea that didn't work. Neoliberalism works even worse, right? And so right now, there is no narrative that can claim to do that job, right? Because we questioned all meta-narratives. But at the same time, it's very dangerous if we go into this standpointism, as I call it, because then we have an array of small group mentalities or identity politics or whatever, each hating each other and competing for resources, for the idea of, okay, I suffered more, so it's kind of a victimhood rivalry. That is also very dangerous, because then we lose something global, something more general that connects us as humans. And that is, of course, the question how we understand that, and what is then more important. But that's one of the things that I try to address also in the book, not directly maybe, but of course, climate change and everything that is connected with the Anthropocene, although I don't like the term Anthropocene, but you understand what I mean. All of these changes coming, and again, something that politicians don't want to see. They don't want to discuss that already in 30, 40 years, there will be many millions of refugees, not like now. So all of these ideas of nation states, these borders and all that, it will be a joke, because no armies will be able to stop these millions. going from the places where you cannot survive. And nobody wants to think about that, because for the politicians, it's important to win the election. So they think in 4 years terms and not in 50-year terms that our children or grandchildren will have to deal with. And that is, of course, an interesting phenomena that also is connected to the lack of imagination, of political imagination, and of being afraid of changes. But it's also connected with exactly this problem that you find in this question. Like, what can still hold us together as humanity? Can we find these things if we agree that we don't want meta-narratives, we don't want the stupid enlightenment and all that? You know, we already, everybody realizes, even in the global north, that it just doesn't work, right? Never worked, actually, for that matter. So this work is still in front of us. We have to find ways of having a dialogue. And I think this is one of the issues now, that many marginalized communities, many people from the margins, many people from the border, let's say, borderlands, they are wonderful at formulating their own positionalities and, you know, like fighting for their autonomy, but not always, and I mean not only social movements here, but also the thinkers, the theorists, so to say. They are not interested in having a dialogue with the global north. But that's wrong, because we have to find a way of still keeping the global community, because otherwise it will be a dangerous place. I mean, it already is, as we see, right, this planet. So I think that maybe we don't like that, maybe it's annoying, but we have to find the way of reconnecting as humans. And that I think we need to discuss. It's not that I have answers for that. Like for me, as I said, one issue that can bring us together, hopefully, is like how to make this planet livable in 50 years and how make the future still possible for not only this species, but also other species.
Thank you, Madina. So our next question is from Sepand Mashregi. Dear Madina, I have been a long-time reader of your work. Thank you for this talk, listening to you discussing coloniality and its multiple faces, temporality and futurity. I think of the woman, life, freedom, Iranian uprising that followed the pandemic and the Ukraine invasion. It has as at its center life, women, and earth as reasons for uprising against all totalitarian and necropolitics of the regime. I wonder if this reimagination of the future can be linked to your idea of re-existence.
Yeah, why not? I mean, I was really impressed when that was happening in Iran. I was trying to read what I could, and I have several Iranian friends here, feminists in Sweden, who were actually sending us some translations of text published in Iran, or at least about that in Farsi. And so, yeah, I think this is really amazing, and this should be regarded as one of the very important first truly 21st century social movements, women's social movements. And as for re-existence, yeah, I am really for this category, and you know, it comes from Colombia. It was coined by Colombian thinker Adolfo Alban several years ago, and he's not only a thinker but also an artist himself. And describing his artistic practices, he came up with this idea of re-existencia, which I like, because resistance is something that we know, and resistance can be violent, it can be very negative. But Adolfo insists that after you're negative and violent and angry, you have to recreate your world anew. You have to rebuild it. You have to reweave it somehow so that it's whole again. You know, it can be home for you. And in order to do that, you have to learn how to re-exist, how to exist anew, so to say. So I think that is very important. The Iranian women resistance that is also very, very generative, very re-existing, right? And very much trying to offer an alternative way of living and way of kind of communicating with the world, with other people and others.
Thank you. Tan, do you want to pose the next question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Professor, I'm really excited and really ecstatic right now. I'm very inspired by your amazing lecture, especially because it had to do with a lot of narratives. And I personally believe that it's necessary for humans to have stories in order to go on and cope with situations. So I have a very normative question, but then it's something to do with what would be the challenges and opportunities of imagining and working towards a different world in the face of unsettlement?
The challenges. Yeah, there's always a challenge, right? And you have to always keep the balance so that you are not too apocalyptic, because you tend to be. You know, when you read what is going on today in the world, it's enough to say, okay, I just quit doing anything because it's the end of the world. So there's a lot of that narrative going on in different forms. But there is also a lot of romanticizing and a lot of escapist narratives, like, okay, let's just imagine a different wonderful world of equal people, you know, and that is also dangerous. And a lot of times you read like, okay, let's go back to some ideal, I don't know, indigeneity that never existed in the form that people imagine it, right? Or some traditional societies that were never the way we think they were. So that is also dangerous, this way of looking at things. And of course, yes, past is very important, and remembering the past and maybe questioning the way official historiography forces us to remember it. But at the same time, we cannot always look at the past, and we should remember and balance this, you know, kind of the idea that we are living in the present, and we have to think about the future to make it happen. So for me, that is a challenge, how to always be critical to yourself and to whatever you're imagining, so that you don't slide into these extremes of this black thinking, okay, so it's just like the end of the world, right? And so there is no way we can change it anyway. Or to this romanticizing and idealizing of the narratives. And of course, ideally, I think that we should actually, I mean, by we here, I mean people who are in academia, really try to go more into the world, to the actual people, to the actual groups. You know, it's sometimes very difficult to do for me, for example, here in Sweden, because there are not many social movements with whom I would identify, right? Maybe only the Sami people, the Sami indigenous people of Sweden. Yes, with them I try to work when I can and invite them, and I'm very interested in their artists and social movements, but not more than that. But there are other places in the world where it's much more penetrable, you know, and where you can be a thinker and a theorist, but also a very important, you know, kind of part of this agency, and work with indigenous movements or the social movements. There should be more of that, and not in this formalized way like universities today all say to us, like, oh, you have to develop these activities, you know, connect to the society, but not in a way like ticking the boxes, you know. It should be real. It should come from the people. And I have wonderful examples of that. Like recently, you know, I was invited to go to Kyrgyzstan. Do you know where Kyrgyzstan is? In Central Asia. It's a wonderful, interesting country. I've never been there. But apparently they read my work and they said, we have a social movement which is called, if you translate it from Kyrgyz language, it's memory. So it's memory work group that goes and talks with people who are still alive in villages, you know, records what happened in Stalinist times, what happened in other times, how millions of people died of hunger because of the Soviet Union and all that, you know. And then later, so all of these things that were never discussed in official historiography. And also they support local culture, this colonial culture that was constantly suppressed. And they are very much bottom up. Because they're not theorists, they're not coming from universities. And I loved doing things with them because I was learning from them. I saw that they came to many things that we've been discussing like this and theorizing without knowing it, you know. They just discovered it by themselves, but in more interesting ways, I would say. So I think this should be developed more. And this is a way of checking what we're doing. Because as theorists, you can go in many ways, you know, but you always risk to be disconnected with reality. And that, I think, is one of the major problems for all of us. And it's not always our fault, but also a fault of the system that is created that way. You just sit in the ivory tower and write something, right? But what happens to the world is not your problem.
Thank you, Madina. So our next question is from Valeria Korabliova. What did we have to unlearn also about ourselves because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. That's also a very good question. I think that it's different for different people, what they have to unlearn, right? I see a lot of people who kind of identify themselves as Russians, let's say, right? And they are really going through serious crisis now, identity crisis. Because indeed, Russian culture is imperial culture, and it's unconsciously imperial, let's say, in many ways, right? I mean, not in all ways, but in many ways, it's like it's not even aware of its own imperial qualities, or the way it colonizes other cultures, or the way it imposes itself. And that is a problem even for people who are open-minded and who are not racist and who are maybe liberal or whatever. I mean, Russian people, that is often a problem. And I mean, I know it from my own experience because I lived in that country for many years. And, writing about post-coloniality, decoloniality was never, ever popular. My colleagues in Russia always say, why would you write about this? It's the problem of these people in the third world. Like, who is interested in that? And they just didn't want to even know about this, And only when I moved to Sweden, and maybe 3 or 4 years ago, finally, there started to come questions from Russia. People started, mostly young generation of people started writing to me and discovering it in their own histories. But I think for people who are over 40, like older than 40, it's a big thing. Like, they really have to deconstruct everything that is in their heads, like question everything. And we argue a lot. Sometimes they insist on speaking Russian with me, and I don't like to speak Russian, even if it's my native language, but I'd rather not speak it, because of obvious reasons, like of what's happened. And they don't see this, it's very difficult for them to connect this and see that when they're speaking Russian to somebody from the former Soviet Union, for example, they are already violating them in some way, right? Because you're forcing them to speak Russian. And so, I mean, there are a lot of things like that people, as I said, they don't necessarily do it on purpose, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done starting with themselves. And that, I think, also is not only about Russians, but it's also about Europeans. I mean, as I was saying, like in Europe, also you can see very false and superficial discourses about what's happening in relation to the war. If you take the old alt-right and people like that, like this core, the traditional conservative, they are either secretly on the Russian side, there are people like that as well, or they are kind of traditionally against Russia in general, but in a very essentialist civilizational way, right? Which of course doesn't make any sense. And so for them, it's not a real political discussion, but more problem you find with the left, because the left, I think they refuse to see what Russia is or what Soviet Union was. And for them, I think it's also a problem of how to, they couldn't even understand at first when I was speaking with my leftist colleagues here in Sweden about this. Like, how can you talk about imperialism or colonialism there? So that is still a novelty to them, that socialism could be colonialist or post-socialism. So that is an interesting thing, also worth discussing. And another thing is that people in the global south were also and are sometimes also reluctant to interpret it in the framework of colonialism and imperialism and post-colonial war, let's say, as you can maybe refer in some ways to this war with Ukraine. I think that reluctance is also, it comes from different, so it's a very complex thing. One is because there's still this legacy of believing in socialism as the only good alternative against capitalism, that is still alive in many people, in many minds, let's say, right? So there is this nostalgia. And of course, it's wrong because we know that what we had in Soviet Union was very far from socialism. But at the same time, people still have that. Another thing is that there is a certain, maybe unconscious rivalry of different narratives. Again, like one narrative is a colonial narrative that is usually associated, like it's the first world and third world, global north, global south. And the second world that is not existent anymore doesn't fit here or there. It doesn't have a space here or there, either in the global north or in the global south. It just kind of is in everybody's way, so to say. And that's why also when, for example, I interview feminists from the global south for our collection with my colleagues here, Suruchita Parbiorket and Redi Kubak, and I was asking them, are you aware of this colonial darker aspects of socialism and post-socialism? And they didn't want to talk about that. So there is this reluctance to connect these two narratives, and see it not as an ideological problem, not as a political problem, but also as a colonial problem and a specific colonialist way of dehumanizing that we can see in relation to Ukraine today. And also, narratives like, okay, this is a white people problem that I also encountered. Like one person told me that, like, okay, it's a problem of white people of global north. It doesn't kind of connect to us, which also, of course, is wrong because it's not about the color of skin. It's about dehumanization as a principle, which you can find in fascism, in Nazism, but also in the behavior of the Russian Empire, not only in relation to Ukraine, but also in relation to Chechnya, in relation to my native Circassians who were almost completely destroyed. It was a genocide in the 19th century, and 90% of them were killed. So I think that there's a lot of learning and unlearning, but it's different for different groups of people in the world.
Patrick, do you want to pose the next question?
Yes, thank you. Madina, I'm fascinated by the concept of unsettlement. And as many of us who grew up in the global south, for instance, in the 80s, amid severe disruptions, we kind of learn how to live with unsettlement beforehand. And then you speak about how countries in the global north are kind of going through their own unsettlement now. So I wanted to ask you, how does unsettlement help nuance or unsettle these contemporary crisis narratives associated with the Anthropocene? And is there any comparison that we can establish with previous periods of unsettlement? Because in your book, you talk about periods of change and accelerated change and crisis and how they may have triggered their own unsettlement.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very complex question also. I mean, there are a lot of sides to it, right? I think that now it's not so drastic. Maybe it's not so. That's why it's difficult to write about this. That it's not perceptible sometimes, right? You feel these changes and these shifts, but they are not immediate, maybe, and the results would come a little bit later. And even with the COVID crisis, with which I started, as I said, writing, I could see, like, at first there was this, inertia, this naturalized attitude in Sweden, like nothing bad can happen to us because we're an ideal society now, like for so many centuries. And then we created the ideal welfare society and state. So nothing can change. And this belief in the state as if it's a god with a capital letter. Like if the state says that, some authorities says that, so nothing can happen. And then, of course, they learned because a lot of bad things happen. And so later, when there was a commission, that specific commission, of course, it's Sweden, so they investigated. And I like the word I was reading in Swedish and translating it for myself, like the word that they used as a result of this commission. They said that actually we learned that our society is not prepared and was not prepared for such an existential challenge as the COVID pandemic. And that is a lot from Swedes to say that, because they are really thinking that they're exceptional and their society is the best. So I think that was a very important shift for them already. And then I think the reaction that, for example, Sweden decided to join NATO is another good sign that shows you, like, after so many centuries, there is this idea of the threat, right? That the possibility of a war, which is larger and more dangerous than wanting to be neutral. And I think that is also an anxiety of a specific kind that adds to their condition of unsettlement, which I think in this case, and in case of many global North people, is actually maybe good. I think they needed that to start feeling something that, as you said, you grew up with it. Me too. Yeah, because I grew up in the Soviet Union, but then it collapsed. So we all had to survive and work in 4 jobs to have enough to eat. So we are used to this. And my whole family, of course, went through that several times during the 20th century. So it's okay with us. And this, I think, is a big difference. But if we think in larger terms, this is what is always happening. Remember that I think it was Césaire who said that when Nazism happened in Europe, Europe just finally experienced something that the colonial world has been experiencing for 5 centuries, right? So Nazis just brought this principle of dehumanization into Europe and imposed it on European people through Holocaust, for instance, and other such things. And I think this is what is happening now too. Like, we are unsettled, we have been unsettled. We learned to live with it, cope with it. We don't even mention it sometimes, right? And when I said I don't have a home, this is what I mean, because I belong to different ethnicities and I don't belong to Russian culture. I have no Russian blood in me, right? But I was forced to live there and kind of be a citizen, but somebody who is a second-rate citizen, is racialized all the time, seen as another, pointed to my place. It is not as good as the Russians, all my life. So I didn't feel at home there, even if I was born in Moscow. So in that sense, I can say that in Sweden, when I'm treated like that, at least it's more honest and fair. Like, I am a foreigner and should be treated like that. I'm joking, of course not. Nobody should be treated like that. But that's what I mean. It's like, you grew up with this and it's okay. And you negotiate these belongings and non-belongings. You know in which situation you are more other, and in which situation you are less another, right? In what sense this structural racism works and intellectual racism works. And I think that Europe now, of course, you cannot generalize. Each country is different, but I've seen it at several places. They are going through this serious rethinking, crisis of legitimacy, as I called it, and trying to kind of come to terms with the new reality. And there are some interesting aspects in that. You can see some groups in Europe, especially anarchist groups. I really like them because now I think they come with much more viable solutions of the future than, for example, old Marxists who are just totally blind to the different reality that is unfolding. Yeah.
Thank you, Madina. I want to ask a question about unsettlement being a generative condition. So you mentioned that we share the sensibility of unsettlement as an awareness of ultimate defuturing, for we tend to still link the feeling of safety with being settled in some space, community, land, family, or group thinking. This is from your book. But for me, still, unsettlement is experienced as a very destructive state of being. So how do you reckon with the physical, economic, and social and emotional toll of unsettlement in your conceptualization of being out of joint as a generative condition? And how do you envision futures being built from within the space of unsettlement? And how can we negotiate this profound and continued need for physical safety, for community building, and access to land and access to resources within these out-of-joint refuturings?
No, of course you're right. It's difficult, but I think that what I meant here is not like safety in the physical sense. Of course, this is our right as humans. We all have the right to be safe physically, right? And have the right to, I don't know, food, water, and basic things. Yes, that should be there. But what I mean is that, one of the things that comes unsettled now and comes undone is the nation state and the system of nation states. And that's another thing that politicians are afraid to even touch, because there was this kind of fragile construction, more a myth than a real thing, right? That we are told to believe that it's a very ancient thing, although nation states, the way they are now, are very new, actually, historically. And now it is coming undone, and wars like this horrible Russian invasion in Ukraine actually add to that, right? Because the whole post-Yalta and post-Potsdam frame of like the world order that was created then is now no longer there, right? So all these organizations like UN, I mean, look at what's happening at UN now. That Russia, who is doing this aggression, is sitting there presiding over UN. I mean, this month is ridiculous, right? But they cannot do anything because there are some regulations in UN. So I mean, that shows that this whole thing can be undone, but that is not just a nation state. It leads to other things, to also your connection to the land, because nation state is all about these national ontologies, because they connect ethnicity, culture, land, language, and all that, which is actually, again, a very arbitrary thing, because in many cases, you don't have to live in your land to have a connection. It can be imaginative. It can be through culture. It can be for many people who may be lost even their land forever and will never come back there because of different reasons, political, conflict reasons, or even Anthropocene reasons. Maybe there will be lands in which you cannot survive anymore because of the climate, or they will be flooded or something. So does it mean that it's the end of this nation? No, but they will live elsewhere and reimagine or continue remembering something through their fairy tales, through their myths, through their, skills, what they do, something, like work with different materials, for instance. And this is what is already happening in many parts of the world, right? So that's what I was thinking, because I really have a problem with the nation state as a concept. And I think it's actually will create more issues in the future. For example, I'm imagining already that when the Russian Empire or contemporary Russia will finally disintegrate, hopefully soon, then you will have this array of different peoples there, right? With different languages, different cultures, because Russia is an unnatural combination of people who were just forced to be together. It's not really a country. It's artificial in that sense. So imagine that more than 150 something, I think, ethnic groups and ethnicities live there. If they all decide to create nation state, it will be a horrible mess. It will be like a balkanization, many times worse, because all of this, borders will be again drawn with the ruler, and there will be many conflicts because of that. So that is another way why we need to think very quickly and soon about these political imaginaries, and how can we reimagine our futures differently, how people can live together, not within this nation state frame with all of its paraphernalia of let's create national myths, how we exclude people, how we see foreigners, all that. That is really sticky. And this has to go, especially if historically people didn't live like that. Like it's a very new thing again to put borders, passports, visas, and all that. But of course, it's easier said than done, because then it entails a lot. There's so many ways of control that, of course, would not like to stop this, right? So yes, we are. That's why I started thinking about it actually when I first read Gloria Anzaldúa, because I sensed in her that she was so. She didn't have anything, right? Living a life on the border, being the border herself, as she says, because she says the border runs through me. It's not that I cross borders, it's myself who is the border. And she didn't have anything, no access to anything. She never was allowed to even finish her PhD during her lifetime, was poor. But at the same time, I learned from her that you can actually make it into a generative condition. So being a border person, living in the borderlands is not only a problem because you're kicked out from everywhere and not seen as belonging anywhere. It's also that gives you additional angles of looking at things, because you are both here and there at once, and you see things that other people are not able to see. And that is your advantage. That gives you actually a chance of survival, a chance of, kind of starting a new life and of re-existing. It's hard. It's really tough, because then we have to also forget about this neoliberal idea of growth, that we all have to become rich, we all have to have material success. So it's not about material success. It's about being in balance with the world, and with yourself. And of course, it's not popular these days, because we're all taught to be consumers. But it has to go, because if we continue like that, there is no future.
On that note, we will end our webinar here. Thank you so much, Madina, for this rich, inspiring, and insightful talk. You gave us a lot of food for thought. And thank you to our participants for joining our webinar and for asking questions.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for asking wonderful questions. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.